Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. When Karen Foster was told that something had happened to her 18-year-old daughter, Bonnie Craig, she knew what it meant. The Alaska State Troopers investigating the scene ruled it a hiking accident, but for Karen, the pieces didn't add up. Bonnie would never have ditched class to go hiking, and she didn't drive, so how would she have reached McHugh Creek, miles out of town in the first place? Armed with little more than her own conviction, Karen set out to find the truth behind her daughter's death. After a long series of false leads and dead ends, it seemed the case would forever go unsolved. Then after 12 years of public campaigning, private despair, and increasingly tense dealings with the detectives working the case, Karen received an email that would change everything. The system at long last had produced a match for the unknown DNA in the case, from a man in a jail all the way across the country. Here is a chilling tale of a mother's unflagging fight to track down the monster who stole her daughter's life, and the battle to ensure that he and others like him would no longer be able to evade justice. The book that we're profiling this evening is Justice for Bonnie, an Alaskan teenager's murder and her mother's tireless crusade for the truth. With my special guests, Karen Foster and I.J. Schecter. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, I.J. Schecter.
Thanks very much for having me, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I guess Karen Foster is having a bit of an issue connecting, so we'll just wait for that. But in the meantime, as the author of this book, we will go from here. How did you become involved with this story and with Karen Foster? How did you come to write this book, Justice for Bonnie? Tell us about that.
My meeting Karen in the first place was a bit of a happy accident. My parents happened to winter in Florida. We're up in Canada, and they ended up renting in the building where Karen happened to be staying. So they encountered Karen one day and heard her very tragic story. And the first thing they did was to call me and ask me if I would have a conversation with her as well. They know that I choose stories based on two things, which is, one, do they have evidence for me as a person, and two, do I think they warrant being told, and do they have a space for the public to see them? So when I heard Karen's story and saw the news footage, I immediately did contact her and went down to Florida to meet with her, and I was struck not only by the heartbreaking nature of the story, of course, something no family should go through, but I was also really struck by Karen's resilience, and I stood in admiration of her approach to this. The first thing I asked her very straight up was, how do you go on? I mean, I have 3 kids myself who are younger, but very frankly, I told her, I don't know if I could endure this, losing one of them. How do you do it? Is it faith in God? Is it spirit? What made you survive? And she simply said, when something like this happens, and your heart is torn out like this, you have 2 choices. You can choose to go on, or you can choose not to. And Bonnie, she said, my daughter Bonnie, would have wanted me to choose the path of going on and honoring her legacy in the best way that I could. And she had other kids that she had to be there for, and a life to live in purpose to honor Bonnie. So we had a very frank and open conversation about not only that, details of the horrors that her family had gone through, and I really appreciated not only how honest she was with me, but the rest of her family as well. They brought me into this world of pain and the nightmare that they had endured, but never with judgment or expectation. They just gave me the information I needed, including the emotions and the feelings, and their sense of solidarity and support to write the story in the way that I hope that I felt it would deserve to be told.
So you came aboard completely after her entire journey and process through the judicial system. So it was after that entire ordeal or journey.
When I came aboard, it was just concluding. So not to jump ahead, but when I connected with Karen, the trial for the man who was accused of murdering her daughter was just coming to its conclusion.
Oh, okay, great. So let's talk about Karen Foster. She hasn't joined us, but you, again, got to know her and really know her and know her family, and you were brought into the worst time in her life, but yet at the same time, as we just mentioned, you came aboard at the time of the trial. So as we alluded to in the opening, that's a 12-year journey for her and her family, and Karen Foster, to find out what really happened. And it's an incredible story. So let's talk about Karen Foster, her background that would prepare her for this campaign, for this crusade, for this fight of her life. Tell us what her background is.
Certainly, and I'll just make one small correction to something you just said, which we'll talk about later, but you mentioned it was a 12-year journey. In fact, it's a 17-year journey. It was 12 years until they found the gentleman who did this, and it was another 4 years of trial, but we'll get to that after. Karen is a very strong, vibrant woman who has been involved in a lot of different things in her life, including journalism, law enforcement, real estate, and a number of other things. She has multiple kids from different relationships, and at the time before this awful event happened, she had not only Bonnie, her daughter, who was 18, but 3 other kids as well from different relationships. She had also gone from her original home in a small town in Canada to a number of different places, in large part because one of her husbands, who worked for BP, the oil company, had been moved around both Canada and the States. So they had lived everywhere from Chestnut Creek in California to Anchorage, Alaska for a period, and many points in between. And eventually they landed back in Anchorage, but there had been time in Calgary, there had been time in different parts of the state, so they moved around a lot. They had a fairly complicated but busy and fun life with multiple kids and different households and such. Bonnie was just starting to attend the University of Anchorage in Alaska. So it was a very busy time for the family, lots of kids doing different things, Karen trying to maintain and juggle this all, but a very, very happy and positive existence. Anchorage is somewhere between kind of a small town and big city. I think most people think of it as a bit of an outpost because it's Alaska, but in fact it's on par with places like Pittsburgh and St. Louis in terms of its size. So it's still a very big kind of thriving community, but because it's Alaskan, it also has a very nice small town mentality where everybody kind of knows everybody.
Now, let's try to explain. I guess Karen would be obviously the person to understand Bonnie absolutely the best, but from your work with Karen, you had a very, very good idea of what Bonnie was really like from her behavior, from her past behavior, from her actions, and from some of the anecdotes, obviously, from her mother that imparted to you and put in this book. So tell us what Bonnie was really like, and before we talk about just before this murder.
Certainly, and I do feel very strongly in a way that I do kind of know Bonnie, even though, of course, by the time I connected with Karen, Bonnie was sadly no longer here, but in a very real way from the stories others tell and the comments that you get and the stories that her family tells, you can get a really strong sense of a person, and I do feel I have that, having written the book and talked to Karen and her family so much. Bonnie was a very driven, optimistic, cheerful young woman who was liked by everybody around her. She had a real activist kind of side to her. She had a friend who sadly lost her life in a drunk driving accident, and no sooner had that happened than Bonnie had started a group called Students Against Drunk Driving at her school. She was the first female on the school wrestling team, So she was very sporty. She was very active. She was a very happy and popular sibling to her brothers and sisters. Very driven in her schoolwork. She would get up early and go to school and study hard, and then go work at Sam's Club after school. So she was that kind of girl that people picture when you think of that kid who wants to do well, succeed, be liked, be good to people, and by all accounts, just a really fine person.
Now, in 1994, where is Bonnie in terms of her life? She has a boyfriend named Cameron who's just gone to school in California. So tell us about, again, we explain her character, but explain this relationship, how serious is it, and just tell us where Bonnie is in terms of her life in September of 1994.
Sure. Bonnie had just started at the University of Anchorage in Alaska, and Cameron Miyasaki, who was her boyfriend for the previous months as well, was a boy that was very smitten with her, and she with him. They would write to each other all the time and spend a lot of time together. And Cameron had just gone off to Berkeley to begin his studies there, but they were still closely in touch and corresponding daily, and had a really sweet love affair going on. And Bonnie had just started her studies in September '94 at the university, and was studying diligently and putting in lots of hours in the school library and in class, and as I said, working a part-time job as well to make money and helping take care of her younger sister, and just starting the life of a very buttoned-down freshman wanting to do great at school.
Now, her father is Gary, if I'm not correct, and she is 18 years old, and she has just decided to move in with her father rather than live with her mother. So tell us about how serious that decision is, or is that just some form of practicality? She seems to understand that decision, so tell us about that.
Yeah, it was in part a practical decision. Gary was the dad who raised her, not her biological father, but the one she had grown up with, and she was 18 years old and becoming more independent, and obviously because of her schedule, both school and work, she wanted to make things as efficient as possible. So it was a decision that she made, and Karen, though it was a little bit painful for her, of course, to have her daughter move out, understood and supported her fully. So she went to live with her dad and be closer to school and be able to get to and from places a little more expeditiously. So that was the reason for that. It didn't cause any discord in the family. It was just, it's hard to let your kid go. You give them roots and you give them wings, but it's obviously tough to let them go as much as you love and support them. So she had just made that move and was living with her dad at the time. And the other kids were split between living with Karen and living off on their own. Her older son, Jason, was living off on his own.
Now tell us about where Karen is and what she's doing when she does get the fateful call. Tell us what she is up to and her reaction to that call. You cover this in the book incredibly, to cover every painstaking and painful and horrific moment. Tell us what she's doing, even what her mood is at that time before this fateful call.
Karen is an avid sailor, as many people around the Alaska area are, and has spent a lot of time on the water. She and a gentleman named Jim, the gentleman she was currently in the relationship with at the time, had gone down to a place called St. Mark's in Florida because Jim's brother, Ken, was getting married. And so they were down there to attend the wedding and celebrate, and had taken the sailboat down around the western lip of Florida. And one night, there were sounds on the boat in the middle of the night that awoke them, and it turned out it was Ken, the brother, coming to tell Karen that he had received some news from Alaska. An Alaskan state trooper had contacted him. They couldn't reach Karen because she was on the boat, so that's who they had somehow gotten to. He showed up at the boat and reached out with a yellow Post-it note saying to Karen, I got a call from an Alaskan state trooper saying they need to talk to you, and in a shaky voice he said it's about Bonnie. And so, of course, in that moment, it's hard to describe for anybody who hasn't gone through it. I fortunately haven't, though I feel through Karen that I can understand it about as well as someone can who hasn't actually lived through the nightmare of that moment. And I think, though it would be clearer coming from her, my sense of it is that it becomes kind of surreal instantly. You are in the twilight zone, you're somewhere else, you're spinning out, trying to make sense of what is a piece of simple information that someone has just given you. There's a name, there's a phone number, and there's news about your daughter. But because of what all this implies or could imply, your mind obviously races and goes to the darkest places. As a parent, your mind goes to those places even on the best of days. Your kid runs across the street, and you freak out. You lose years off your life just from that event. So you can imagine what it feels like when someone reaches out with a number of a trooper and says it's about Bonnie. What he said was she was in a hiking accident. That is the news that he had received from the trooper, so he relayed this to Karen as well. Karen was trying to, through her confounded state, make sense of it. So she asked him a number of questions over and over, even as she was trying to keep it together. And he kept saying, look, all I have is a name and a phone number, and they just need you to call them. So they immediately packed up their things from the boat, went into town, found a payphone, and then she made the call to the trooper. And the trooper told her her daughter had been in an accident, had fallen off a 30-foot cliff at a place called McHugh Creek, which is a popular place to go in Anchorage, and was dead.
Now, we talked about Karen's background, but the background also includes some serious police work, undercover work, and some heavy undercover work. So she's what I don't even know what the word is, but she's a veteran, and she's hard-nosed, and so immediately, what is her reaction in terms of how she deals with this? Some people would deal with it differently, but how does she deal with this news initially? Besides this initial sort of denial but when she does get that information, what is in her mind in terms of when she hears hiking accident? What's Bonnie's experience? What does she immediately think in terms of a hiking accident?
I agree with you that different people react to that kind of news differently. I think some people get angry, some people get defensive, some people deny, some people simply freak out emotionally. Karen had spent some time as a volunteer undercover detective on the Anchorage force, and had spent a lot of time participating in everything from detective raids to drug busts to trying to bust people who were doing wrong in the community. So she kind of snapped into what I would call detective mode. When she first heard hiking accident, her first reaction was that it couldn't be. One of the things she thought was Bonnie would never go alone out there. How did she get up on a cliff? How would she fall off a cliff accidentally? How would she get there? She didn't drive a car. She started asking all of these questions naturally because of, I think, her detective work, and immediately started kind of interrogating in her own mind to try to put together the pieces of it that was obviously very fuzzy and preliminary for her, but that was her natural bent. So when she got on the phone to the trooper in Alaska, she started asking these questions, and of course they had very few answers. They simply kept repeating the information they had, which was that we're very sorry to tell you this, but she fell off a cliff. She's lost her life, and it was clearly an accident. So she started saying, where's her ID? Where was her backpack? Where's her wallet? None of which they had. They had identified her from her class ring, which is all they had. So one of the questions Karen was asking was, then what accounts for where her stuff went? How did she get there? How can you explain a fall? This is an athletic girl who's strong, coordinated, and it seemed immediately absurd to her, not only the story that she would go out there by herself, but that she would have an accidental slip and fall off a cliff from that height in that way. So she immediately went into that mode and stayed there, maybe as a defense mechanism to try to keep it together. I think we all do different things in the face of news like that to try to stay composed, let's say. And I think that was her way of staying composed in the moment, going into interrogation mode and trying to get information. So she called journalists that she had known from the city. She called contacts in the homicide department that she had known, just trying to pull together whatever information she could based on this vague bit of news that she had received.
Let's talk about she had relationships with police. She also had relationships with media. And part of her venting, or part of her reaction to this, is that she's angry at the police not giving her any more information, even though she knows that they can't give her any information. So probably against, and not that the police are advising her, but probably against the wishes of the police, because it's an ongoing investigation, but they have deemed it an accident in her mind. That's what they've told her. What does she do to the media? What does she say to the media in terms of this hiking accident theory or conclusion that the police have made? What does she say to the media, and how does the media react to her claims?
Well, you know, Dan, it's very funny. One of the shocking things that one discovers in learning about a story like this is that the families of victims of crimes like this are actually the people at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of receiving information or being able to access information or answers. The families actually have no standing in the correctional system. So, in fact, the police are under no obligation to tell the family anything, which seems stunning when we say it, but it's true. So you really are kind of on an island trying to find things out by yourself. So Karen was saying to anybody who would listen, including the journalists who were now trying to get to her, TV people trying to get her to do interviews, she would say yes to all of it. And, of course, this is just in the hours after finding out. So she was telling people, if it's Bonnie, it can't be an accident. It must be murder. It couldn't have been an accident. None of it adds up. So she was trying to scream it from the rooftops and use any pulpit she could, to try to find out by enlisting the help of the media and the public and the community. As I said, it's a tight-knit community. Everybody knows everybody, and she had many contacts. So she was trying to leverage that profile to get people on side and try to find out answers along with her. The police were staying tight-lipped because they had ruled it an accident, and that's the only thing they were telling her. As soon as she got back and met with the lead detective on the case, she tried to ask every possible question she could from every angle, and she was getting what she felt was stonewalled at every turn. They would say to her simply, "We're telling you everything we can right now. It was an accident. We're extremely sorry. We will follow every lead and find out everything we can, but there's nothing more we can tell you." So Karen did a lot of interviews, talked to everybody she could, and just tried to build a groundswell of support to get information. And you have to remember, in a case like this, there's immediately a lot of frustration that goes around. There's frustration on behalf of the police, who feel potentially that they're being told they're not doing their job if they don't have everything solved right away, which they rarely do. There's frustration on behalf of the family, feeling like they're being told nothing when they're the first people who should be told. There's frustration on behalf of the community and the public, who have suddenly lost a young member they've lost one of their own, and it promotes fear, it increases anxiety, it creates a whole collective feeling of something totally different from what came before, and they want answers too. So within hours, you've got a bunch of different parties or factions who are kind of necessarily at cross purposes.
Within about 3 months, you write that an important figure is discussed in the book, Sergeant Mars, and Bonnie is contacting this person and, again, voicing her concerns. And she asked if Bonnie was raped. Now, his answer was, I'll get you to answer what his answer was, but she also was pushing to fight to see the autopsy report. So tell us a little bit about Sergeant Mars, the relationship they had, and this question of rape, and this is a strong question for Karen to ask, and the result from this Sergeant Mars and this question put to him.
Sergeant Mars was the lead detective on the case, and he was on one hand being as forthcoming as he could with Karen, and on the other hand, she was feeling like she was getting no information from them. So for every question that she asked, she felt like she was getting more and more pushed away. The detectives would often tell her, it's not a great idea for you to go to the media, for the reason that if anyone does have critical information, you might scare them off. You never know when someone might come forward with the critical piece that we need, and the more you're out in the public, the more that probably dissuades that person. That was one thing. The other thing was that a number of people had called into the detectives to give this tidbit or that information about what they might have known about Bonnie or seen, and every time Karen had heard from one of them that they had called and would then ask Sergeant Mars or the others, they would say the same kind of non-answer, which was, we're following every lead, we don't really have the time to update you daily because that would take away from the time doing the actual work of the investigation. To which she would reply, what's the work on the investigation that you're doing? I'm not seeing any evidence of it. And they would repeat the pat answer that the detectives have to give, which is, we're doing everything we can. When she asked him, was she raped, she got a similar answer, which was, there's not much we can tell you. We're following leads. She asked to see the autopsy report, and again found the shocking result that even as the mother of the victim, she had no right to go talk to the medical examiner to see the autopsy report. You would imagine that she would be the first person to be able to see such things. So Sergeant Mars alluded to vaginal injury and tear, but she was not able to obtain any more information than that, as hard as she tried to get more.
Tell us about the event where she sees, and how she sees this, is sees evidence of broken knuckles on her daughter, Bonnie, and scraped hands, and then her reaction when she realizes or believes that she has a different conclusion once seeing that. When
Karen and her family had to undertake the very awful exercise of going in and seeing Bonnie's body, they had lowered the sheet from her face, and Karen had already identified her, but now she was with her kids and her husband. And when she pulled the sheet down further and took Bonnie's hand in hers, she noticed that her knuckles were swollen, and she noticed bruising on Bonnie's arms. So Karen immediately said to the troopers, you need to come back in. These are defensive wounds. She knew this from her police training. And there's no other explanation for someone having broken knuckles and bruised arms other than, probably something other than an accidental slip off a cliff. That wouldn't be the case, most likely. So she immediately identified that as a red flag, and then some, and called them back in to continue investigating. And in the course of further investigation, they found extensive other injuries, 11 different lacerations on the back of Bonnie's head, which were obviously telltale, which were to Karen telltale of something other than an accidental fall. Other bruises, cuts, a broken finger, etc. So that immediately changed the course of things.
When you say change the course of things, tell us how we get to the point, tell us the process where we get to the point where the medical examiner either changes his mind or the official conclusion from the medical examiner that it is not an accident. Tell us about this process to get to a different conclusion completely.
When Karen was finally allowed to come in and see the autopsy report, in part through the support of other groups that had helped lobby and advocate for her to be able to do so, she first saw a note on the report that said the conclusion was homicide. That was one thing. So she had asked the medical examiner why she was never told about that. And again, he has to be as kind of on the fence as the detectives are, giving no concrete or conclusive information. So she did what she does and asked him as many questions as she could. He told her about all the different injuries. He told her about the vaginal tears and what that implies. And what he said to her most crucially at the end was that we won't call it good news, but there's one productive thing that we can take away from this. And Karen said, what's that? And the medical examiner said, whoever did this to your daughter left his DNA. And that means that they can then try to find a match to someone.
Now, speaking of DNA, almost every one of the programs I've done that's anything, I might say current, even in the last 40 years, we have to explain what the status of the DNA was at the time of the crime, and in a lot of cases, the DNA status later at the trial or when they find a perpetrator. And in this case, too, it's another case of a CODIS situation. And what is the status of DNA collection? What are the rules in 1994?
Yeah, as you mentioned, both the technology for collecting changes over time, and of course the rules and policy changes over time too. So at the time of Bonnie's murder, DNA was not being collected into any database or system on arrest, as a matter of course. So if someone was charged with a felony, their DNA did not necessarily go into a system. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the trial. But the fact that they had a DNA sample in Bonnie didn't necessarily give them any further upper hand, because what you need to do at that point is try to find matches in a one-off, ad hoc kind of way. The detectives had been investigating different people, and over the course of the subsequent months and even a few years, different suspects emerged. A couple of young men who had worked with Bonnie at Sam's Club who were potentially suspicious for one reason or another. They would bring them in, the detectives would bring them in, test them against the DNA sample, and ultimately they all proved not to be a match. There was a bus driver who had worked on Bonnie's route who also became a suspect, who had then moved down to California, and the detectives had even flown down to interrogate him and brought him in as well to try to match the sample, and he was also not a match. So this is a very slow, one-off, step-by-step process, and you're not actually trying to match people until they become suspects. It's a little bit backward, one would say, and you're always trying to reverse engineer the process. So at the time, there's no database, there's no group of samples from which you can choose.
Now, you talked about what Bonnie was doing, and this is a huge portion of this book, is this incredible crusade that Karen Foster undertakes. So what are the things specifically, and you just mentioned a little bit of the support of people that she aligns with, some of the major characters that she aligns with a common cause and actual organizations trying to make a huge difference. So what specifically does Karen start with, and what does she move towards in terms of specific changes that are important to this story and just important for the fight against and fight injustice, period?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think it's important to say that in every story like this, in every tragedy, in every crusade, there are always a number of small heroes along the way, and that's certainly the case in Karen's story, and I think she would say the same. There are a couple of individual women in particular in the community. One was named Sandy Cassidy and another was named Janice Leinhart, who either volunteered of their own accord, in Sandy's case simply because she was a member of the community who heard about the story and cared as a fellow mother, and in Janice's case, as someone who had formed a group called Victims for Justice because of a tragedy in her own life. People like this came out of the woodwork to support Karen. In the case of the latter, it was something that Sergeant Mars had suggested Karen get involved in as a way of finding support from others. And so through those different groups and that different support, Karen found at different points the continuing strength to go on and continue the crusade and the campaign. Part of what they helped her do was to raise money to get back into the media, continue to give interviews. At the point where Karen had kind of lost hope and was becoming really despairing, people like Sandy and Janice bucked her up, helped her keep the story public, try to rally the community around the story to try to get answers. So they had things like ads on the sides of buses saying who killed Bonnie. They wrote articles in the local newspaper. They tried to get into as much media as possible, and that did have the effect of raising the profile of the story again, for the nature of these things, because sadly a number of things do happen in this world. You're on page one on the first day, and then quickly it slips to the back page, and then no sooner has that happened than it disappears from people's consciousness altogether. So going back into the media and raising the awareness again had a positive effect, not only on people putting more pressure on the detectives, but even personally, people coming to support Karen. You go from being the mother of the girl who was murdered, who people tend to avoid because they don't know what to say, to people coming up and hugging you spontaneously on the street and offering whatever help they can give. So from that, they pushed for information. They pushed for the detective to try to be more open with them. They started pushing for laws to be changed about the collection of DNA. Karen spent time with with Governor Palin, Sarah Palin, who helped her in a matter of, I think it was 13 days, pass a bill to cause Alaska to start collecting DNA on arrest, when very few states were doing it at the time.
That's brilliant. Now, and in this evolution from her initial anger and her channeling her energy towards something very, very good and cathartic for her, really, her relationship with the police, even though she had some experience with the police and police work, she has a different understanding of what the police were doing, and her attitude about the police from the beginning changed, didn't it, towards the police?
Yeah, I think you're generally going from feeling like you're in the light to the dark when something like this happens. You obviously want answers immediately. You want closure as quickly as you can get it, and then you go through this terrible cycle of hope followed by despair, followed by faith, followed by pessimism. Every time a new suspect comes up, you hope, and then every time the detective calls you and says they're not a match, you're ready to give up. And I think that becomes more and more difficult over time, so that by the fourth or fifth time, you think to yourself, they must be trying to do their jobs, but at the same time, every person who comes up is a false lead or a dead end. So, you try to take matters into your own hands as much as possible. She had done things like walked Bonnie's route from home to school to try to uncover her own clues or whatever evidence she could. And you want to give the police the benefit of the doubt and have faith that they're doing everything they can, and you know that yours is not the only case, and you know that unfortunately some things don't get solved, but it's hard. Intellectually you know that, but emotionally that's a hard thing to manage. You still want answers.
Now tell us about Trooper Tim Hunyer, and 12 years later, where is Karen Foster in terms of just personally in her life, when she gets the email message, and what is her reaction, and what is contained in that email message that is so profound?
At that time, so it's now December 2006, January 2007, and Karen had gone on a trip with a friend who had persuaded her to go away and try to have some fun and take some pleasure out of life. The case has now, for all intents and purposes, gone cold. They've tried everything they could, but suspects are no longer coming forth. Sergeant Mars has retired from the force, so different people have been assigned to the case, but there's not much happening and no information really coming through. So Karen was on a trip in Manila in the Philippines with a friend, and one night on the little computer that she had brought with her on the trip, out of nowhere an email popped up from the gentleman you referred to, Tim Hunyer, who had been on the force for a number of years in different capacities, and actually had retired, but then had been asked to come out of retirement to go back onto the cold case unit. And she received an email from him, just a couple of lines long, introducing himself and saying, there's been a development in Bonnie's case, and can you contact me? Now, of course, she's in the Philippines, and it's the early 2000s, so it's not that easy to make contact. So over the course of the next couple of days, in fits and starts, she tried to make contact with Detective Hunyer and exchanged a couple of email messages with him. Excuse me. And he made reference to a man named Kenneth Dion. He told her over the course of a few emails that there had been a hit on the DNA of this man, who was actually in a jail in, of all places, New Hampshire, for a different crime. And he was serving a 6 to 15 there. Excuse me. And that there had been a hit and a match. And they were investigating. So, of course, as I said, after the emotional roller coaster that she had endured, your hope immediately flares, but your skepticism does as well. So 100% of you wants to hope, and 100% of you says, don't get your hopes up because we know where this goes. So she asked him as many questions as she could. And Detective Hunyer said, well, he has a record. We've got a DNA hit. His information is in the database in CODIS, and we're following up. That's what he said. We're following up, and we'll tell you what we can. And so soon after that, she started for home.
Now, he had questioned Dion, and so he got some information that Karen. Now it had taken her 4 years to find out, so some information, again, was gotten from that conversation, and then later, I guess once there was the actual talk of a pretrial, he was still awaiting extradition, but they could talk about pretrial, so that's how serious they were. So what was that bit of information that Karen, it took 4 years for Karen to find out, that was gotten from that interview that the Trooper Hunyer had with Dion?
Right. So this interview had happened prior to the contact that Detective Hunyer made to Karen. Excuse me. But Karen didn't know and wouldn't find out until much later in the trial that this interrogation had gone on. So Detective Hunyer and a colleague had actually gone down to New Hampshire and had interrogated Mr. Dion, unbeknownst to Karen at the time. It was one of the more fascinating things that I discovered in the book in terms of detective work. Tim Hunyer would be, in many people's minds, the kind of archetypal figure of a soft-spoken Midwestern guy, very unassuming, but he demonstrated brilliant detective work in this interview, this interrogation with Mr. Dion. Later on, they would show it at the trial, and Karen would see it in full and find out everything he had done. He established a rapport with Kenneth Dion and started slowly asking him questions and uncovering inconsistencies in the story and such. He asked him if he had ever known Bonnie, had he heard of her, and of course it was met with a bunch of denials and contradictions in the story. So when you read the transcript or see the footage of the interrogation, you come to greatly respect this man for his detective work and how pivotal this conversation was in turning things around. In terms of the pretrial, extradition is more difficult than people think, so you would imagine why, once you have a hit, why can't you just fly the man from New Hampshire to Alaska and start a trial and get on with things? But obviously the wheels of justice turn a bit more slowly than that, and there are lots of reasons for things to be delayed. So incredibly, there were 4 years of pretrial hearings and delays. Judges get switched off, people go on vacation, attorneys and prosecutors claim they don't have enough information and need more time. A whole host of reasons that became increasingly frustrating for Karen and her family. So on one hand, there's the, I don't want to say exhilaration, there's the satisfaction of finding out that there's a man here who they think may be the actual killer. There's a real match. It's a person who was in the city at the time, and that's enough to produce a lot of hope. On the other hand, you want to you want the wheels to move even faster once you know that, and in a way they move even slower because they're processing a lot of cases. They're doing these pre-trials where you feel like information is coming in dribs and drabs, and meanwhile he's still in New Hampshire, etc. Eventually, she got a call, Karen did, from Detective Hunyer saying the extradition has happened and he's in Alaska, he's in the state. I think creates a whole bunch of discrepant feelings in someone like Karen. As the mother of the victim, you feel a whole new sense of invasiveness and disgust and repugnance for this man, and then of course you also feel the hope of things moving along step by step, even if they're moving slowly. And so 4 years later, which is now 17 years later from the time of the murder, the trial finally began.
They do offer him not much of a deal, 75 years. So, of course, his defense says no, and he goes to trial. We can't go into the entire trial, but what are some of the first things, some of the evidence that, again, that Karen Foster realizes now for the first time? Talk about the leaf with a single drop of blood, because that seems to be, at least the defense tries to make a lot of hay out of that one.
Yes, blood was one of the elements that became a very big deal in the trial. One has to remember that, of course, the onus is on the prosecution here to, as we've all heard, prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the man is guilty. He was accused of 4 counts of 3 counts of murder and 1 of sexual assault. And all the defense has to do is prove reasonable doubt, or create reasonable doubt, rather, in the minds of the jurors. The only thing they found with blood on it at the site of McHugh Creek was a single leaf with 1 drop of blood. The team defending Dion made a big deal out of the fact that had she been beaten, raped, bludgeoned, thrown off a cliff, wouldn't you see more blood everywhere? Wouldn't you see spatters? Wouldn't you see a trail, a trail of blood on the ground? Wouldn't you see scrapes, disturbed foliage, debris everywhere, things like that? But they focused a lot on the blood because that leaf was the only thing found anywhere on or near the site with any blood on it. So that was one of the things that they made a very, very big deal out of repeatedly. They kept coming back to that. So on one hand, on one side, you had the prosecution placing Kenneth Dion there by virtue of the evidence of the fact that his DNA was inside Bonnie's body. And you had the defense saying there's no evidence, there's no weapon, there's 1 drop of blood, nobody can say they saw him, nobody saw the car that fit his description. So to them, that was enough for reasonable doubt. And they kept coming back to the blood again and again. When the medical examiner would take the stand and say the 11 lacerations on her head are not consistent with what would be an accidental fall, where you would see kind of a random pattern of bruises and cuts and scrapes, they would come back to the blood and say, well, where's the blood from this beating and rape that you're talking about? There's no evidence of a physical beating. There's no evidence of blood, and there's none of that.
To be, again, just to add to this incredible mix to this story, there's a video of the crime scene. Initially, it's lost. There seems to be a deputy was in charge instead of the senior person. Interviews were not recorded. No footprints, hairs, fingernail scrapings, clothing, fibers. Of course, no weapon was found, and very little blood. So again, a field day for a defense lawyer to try to raise reasonable doubt. Am I correct?
Yes, indeed. In fact, the reason Bonnie was discovered was because a girl in the community happened to be in McHugh Creek that day, and she was the one who spotted Bonnie's body down in the creek. And she had gone to a phone and called 911 and gotten in touch, and that's what alerted the law enforcement to the fact that Bonnie was there in the first place. And yes, by all appearances, the investigation initially was not done in the most airtight manner. They didn't necessarily collect the things they should have. This was resolved a little bit later when they showed the video. It was actually a positive thing for Karen because it helped fill in the picture for her a little bit to show that they had actually done a more diligent job than she had assumed. And in fact, after she saw that, she stopped the detectives in the hall and outside the courtroom and actually thanked them genuinely for doing work that she thought they had neglected to do. So yes, while they did provide a lot of fodder for the defense to go after them for conducting an investigation that didn't necessarily produce the evidence they might have, frankly, the evidence might not have been there anyway.
What's interesting is that Dr. Arndt von Hippel, Dr. Arndt von Hippel takes the stand, and he really doesn't, as you write in the book, he doesn't really do anything for the defense or prosecution, at least doesn't seem so. What is his testimony regarding Bonnie?
He was a bit of an odd duck. He is someone who had contacted Karen soon after the murder, or soon after the death of Bonnie had been known, and Karen had gone over to his home and had tea, and he had told Karen that he had been out that day at McHugh Creek and had seen a group of young people, 2 girls and two guys, and that he after seeing the pictures of Bonnie on TV, he remembered one of them as having been Bonnie, and that she was very lighthearted and energetic, bounding down the steps and so forth. And when he then later took the stand, as you said, he was not of much use to either side. In fact, he was older and a little bit, I don't want to say flippant, but he was kind of just talking. He didn't say much that was of help to either side, because he said what he had said before to Karen, that he felt he had seen her that day, but he couldn't say whether he had seen, again, any evidence of Kenneth Dion. He couldn't really place a time or fix her in a specific spot. So the information that he gave kind of amounted to nothing in the end.
He did say that he recognized at the time Kenneth Dion, but then later could not say he was sure on the identification of Kenneth Dion. So again, adding to
Exactly. Right, and again, we have to remember that all the defense needs to do is create reasonable doubt, and the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So when someone goes up and says, I'm pretty sure that was the guy I saw, but then later says, I can't really be sure, that's not proving beyond a reasonable doubt. So that plays into the defense's hands, certainly, instead of the prosecution. If you're sure, you're sure. And as we know, the one thing that can sink a testimony right away is any kind of inconsistency. And we're not talking about a crime that happened a day ago or a month ago. We're talking about something that happened almost 2 decades ago. And so one of the big challenges for the prosecution was trying to get consistent stories first of all, trying to get people in the first place who could even talk about any kind of memory at the time of Bonnie, of the event, of the timeline, and further to that, talk about it in a consistent and or specific way. That's hard enough. We've all heard from psychologists about how different witness testimony can be. Take 3 people who saw something yesterday, and you'll still inevitably almost get 3 different stories. Now go 17 years into the past and try to get consistent stories out of people.
Right. Now, this attorney Lambert for the defense is capable, and he's, aggressive and vigorous defense. You can put it that way, which includes some attacking of not character, but attacking of stories. And so he's doing what he can. What he does, though, is that he is questioning the character of Bonnie Craig, isn't he?
Yeah, and I don't think attacking character is an inaccurate phrase there. That is precisely what he did. He took 2 lines of questioning for most of the witnesses who came up. One was what I talked about regarding the blood and the lack of evidence. So people would come up and talk about the fact that there was what they felt was evidence for the fact that Kenneth Dion had committed this murder, and he would respond it again and again by saying, did you see any blood? Can you prove in any way that you saw him, that he was there, that you identified his car, anything? And of course they would say, well, no, I can't. And the second thing he did, which was obviously much more objectionable and hurtful to Karen and her family, was, I guess, what any defense team does when they're grasping at straws, which was to call into question Bonnie's character and integrity. So he would do things like refer to the fact that she was out playing pool with a group of other students one night and talking to a boy, when she had this boyfriend in Berkeley, or the fact that she exchanged phone numbers with a classmate, things like that. So he would ask Gary when he was on the stand about whether, as her father, he knew everything she did and everywhere she was all the time. And of course, no parent knows that of an 18-year-old, and so he would honestly have to answer, well, no, of course, and those kinds of things. This is obviously for the purpose of casting doubt in the jury's mind about what kind of person Bonnie was, which is reprehensible when you compare it to the comments that you get even today on, let's say, the Facebook page that we have for the book. The way people talk about Bonnie, the hurt that they still feel in the community for her loss, the kinds of testimonials that you get about her as a person stand in such stark contrast to that line of questioning that, even as someone who is not her parent, it even makes my blood boil.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple things we got to talk about. Is that the deft work that Hunyer does is that he gets Dion to really relax and talk too much. And so, as such, he talks about his martial arts tools, his edged weapons, his nunchucks, and also a weapon called a sai, S-A-I. Tell us a little bit about that and just the importance of those weapons.
Yeah, as I said, it was a demonstration of truly brilliant detective work, almost like a movie scene that you would see, imagining a detective in the movies, just as you say, relaxing someone, establishing rapport, and then getting them to do what people shouldn't do when they're trying not to reveal anything, which is talk. He just got him to talk. So, yeah, he talked about the fact that he had some drug addiction problems. He had a failed marriage. He was into martial arts and carried weapons in his trunk and such. And the sai is a small kind of hooked weapon, which was consistent with one of the key injuries on the back of Bonnie's head that the medical examiner referred to. So while the defense was repeatedly saying these injuries would not come from a baseball bat or an axe or something else, the martial arts weapons that he had were a potentially positive reference to the kinds of injuries that she had sustained.
Now, when we talked about, and I mentioned that the video of the crime scene, and this is very important, this is a profound scene in the book too, was originally lost. Now, it is found. And so describe that moment. It's a very, again, movie-esque scene. So tell us about what happens there and what is the result of this, again, what was lost and now is found. What's that repercussion in court? And tell us how it all works out.
Well, I think in the first place, for Karen, this is a deeply profound moment, as I said, because you have in your head a bunch of questions about how the investigation played out. You have the feeling, as I said before, as the family of being the people who should be getting information first, and in fact you're getting it last if you're getting it at all. So you have to fill the pictures in your head of what went on or what didn't go on, what was asked, what wasn't asked, what was investigated and what was not. So Karen had thought for all this time that not only had they maybe bungled the investigation, but maybe had not even really conducted a full investigation. She had almost no picture in her mind of what had gone on. Seeing the video in court really helped her make a kind of emotional passage to a place where there was some level of closure and satisfaction. On one hand, you are seeing, and I don't want to, you can't overstate the emotional power of this. You're seeing your child lying face down in a creek, dead. So there's that to try to deal with, but it stands in contrast to the fact that at least you're getting some satisfaction that the police did the job they were supposed to do. And then in terms of the trial, it also showed that a full investigation of the crime scene was done, and it showed that Bonnie was down in the creek in the cold. This is glacier-fed water, so there were a couple of implications. One, blood that she may have had on her may have been washed away by the creek. Who knows? And also showed a certain position that she was in. It showed that she was in the creek at a certain time, in a certain way, and that it allowed the prosecution to take the position that Kenneth Dion may have murdered her, taken her down into the creek for the very purpose of trying to wipe away any evidence that could have incriminated him.
Right. Now, the other thing that Lambert does, too, just to, again, do everything he can in this vigorous defense, is to get a medical examiner that disputes the claim of homicide by the medical examiner for the prosecution, Dr. Norman Thompson. So a person from San Diego County, a guy named Harry Bonnell, he's a chief deputy medical examiner. What is his disagreement, and what exactly is the root or the basis of his disputing that medical examiner Thompson's conclusions?
His disagreement was largely insubstantial. He had based it on some information that people research about something that we call falls from heights. So when people fall from certain heights, there are lots of studies that show the way they fall, the rate at which they fall, the angle at which they fall, and how that relates to certain injuries they can sustain. As I said before, if someone falls accidentally, you expect to see a kind of arbitrary pattern of bumps, bruises, cuts, and so forth. There's a certain area in the back of the lower neck which is generally protected in a fall, and that's where she had that injury that was in that interesting shape, which was not just a standard one that one sees. So on one hand, the medical examiner was saying that's not the kind of injury you would see from an accidental fall, because even when someone falls from a height, that's usually not where you get an injury. It's just protected because of the part of the body that it's on. But Dr. Bonnell was saying, well, no, that could be consistent with a fall from that height. But the prosecution did a really expert job of dissecting his testimony, not only showing that he was not the expert that he purported to be in terms of this topic, but that he was not necessarily engaged in the way a witness should be. He fell asleep at one point between the testimonies during a break. They proved that he had not been the expert on the literature that he claimed to be, and in addition, he was the kind of person that testified at a number of different trials. And so there was the suspicion on Karen's part that he may not have been there as a fully legitimate witness so much as someone invested in testifying at trials.
Right. One of the most profound testimonies, and it was a surprise for Karen, and I guess it would be a surprise for anyone, Kenneth Dion's ex-wife, Tammy Aronson. So tell us about the meeting and her testimony, what it is that she testifies to that is helpful for the prosecution, and then what is Karen's reaction to her afterwards?
Well, answering your second question first, Karen, as I said, through all this goes through a real emotional welter. So over the course of these years, there's such an incredible roller coaster of different feelings. As I said, from hope one day to despair the next, from feeling in the dark one day to getting information the next, so on and so forth. And one of those moments had to do with when Tammy Aronson testified. This is, Kenneth Dion's ex-wife. And on the stand, she talked about both the difficulties they had in their marriage, his aggressive and violent streak, and she painted a picture of him that I think helped the jurors see him as the kind of person who could indeed commit this kind of act. Karen, to her great credit and admiration, at least in my eyes, went out of the courtroom afterwards and stopped Tammy. And despite all the different things that one imagines she could have said to her, expressed sympathy, woman to woman, wife to wife, and told her that essentially she was sorry that she had to go through those things.
Now, the defense has another witness. It's a nurse that's their supposed rape expert, but not really an accredited, rape expert. And as you write, it's not significant, helpful for the defense testimony either way. So in the end, in conclusion, with the prosecutor and with the defense, what was the prosecution's stated, surmised case so that the jurors could contemplate what was that, as opposed to the defense summation?
Well, with regard to the nurse that you referred to, the defense also made a big deal about the fact that, yes, there was his DNA in Bonnie, but that only proves that sex occurred. It doesn't prove rape, and it doesn't prove assault. And they pointed to the fact that things like vaginal tearing or such can happen from rough consensual sex. It can result from dryness, a whole bunch of things. So yes, those kinds of testimonies went back and forth. Ultimately, the prosecution appealed to the jury's common sense and sense of truth and logic by saying, we have heard from people and we now know who this girl is and what she was. It does not make any sense that she would have been there on her own. We don't know how she could have gotten there on her own. All the testimony that you've heard, including in particular the pattern of the physical injuries and the lacerations, do not have any logical connection to what would be an accidental fall. And you've got a man here with a certain history, and it's true, we don't have evidence of extensive blood, we don't have a weapon, we don't have witnesses, but search your minds and listen to your hearts and come back with what is the right decision.
And what did the defense counter? Again, he has to do his job, and how does he counter that?
The defense reiterated much of what they had said throughout the month-long trial. Again, those two things. We're very sorry that this happened. It's an obvious tragedy, but the fact is, we need to prove reasonable doubt, and there's certainly plenty. There's no blood where we would expect blood. There's no weapon. There's no evidence of disturbance in the area, physical disturbance to the grounds. There's no one who saw this man who can put him at the scene or in connection with Bonnie. There's DNA that proves sex but proves nothing else. There's no one who saw a car, etc. So they stuck to the practical facts and the truthful line that there was no real concrete evidence proving murder.
What is Karen's support system there? Who are the people that are there? There are numerous people, but just tell us of the support system that she has there. And at that point, because we didn't cover this, the ups and downs, you say the roller coaster of emotions that she must have endured through this. She did endure through this. But what is her reaction at the end? What is her feeling towards the likely conviction? She doesn't know, of course, but what is her sense, having experienced this trial? What does she think's going to happen? What's her state of mind?
Well, the one thing she feels is a lot of appreciation for the prosecution team because they had kept her highly involved, and where she had been getting what she felt was little to no information from the detectives all this time, she was getting a lot of information and presence from them. So she was able to contribute opinions and help out with preparing preparing the case and choosing witnesses and such. So she felt very involved the whole way through, as did the rest of her family. Many of them were there, obviously, throughout the trial. Over the course of these years, lots of things had happened in her family, marriages, divorces, parents dying. She had lost a brother to an accident during that time. So obviously over the course of anybody's life in 17 years, lots of things happened in a family. So there had been many changes for her, independent of this quest, excuse me, to try to find and put away Bonnie's killer. So when the jury goes out to make their decision, it's up in the air. You want to convince yourself, obviously, with as much hope as possible that they'll come back and deliver the verdict that you want to hear. But on the other hand, you've heard the defense for weeks repeat the same line again and again, pointing out the fact that there's so little evidence, and again, all they have to do is create a bit of doubt in the right person's mind, and then the man walks free. So she doesn't know. She's hoping against hope.
And what does happen? How long does it take the jury to deliberate? How long does it take for them? And what, as you see in almost all court dramas, what does it indicate? A short comeback or a long comeback? Are there any requests for any, again, specific requests for more information or clarification? How does that little process go? And the trepidation must be brutal. And how long does it take?
Yeah, I think in general it's fair to say that the longer a jury is out, I suppose the more thinking you can do, and the more they're deliberating, the more doubt it would cast in your own mind. They end up coming back, excuse me, in just a matter of hours, where the expectation was that it would take quite a bit longer than that, maybe days or weeks, who knows. But they come back in just hours, and that's exciting news because, again, as a general principle, I think it stands to reason that the quicker they decide, the more clear they are about their agreement one way or another. Of course, that agreement could be that he's innocent. Who knows? But it's at least a moment of excitement, let's say, to know that there's a decision forthcoming, and you don't have to wait any longer to know what's going to happen.
So tell us about Kenneth, before we get to the decision, what's Kenneth Dion's behavior at trial? What is his, anything that he does say? What is just his temperament and disposition at this trial? How does he conduct himself?
He is mostly a closed book. He mostly is quiet and stares straight ahead. He has what Karen interprets as a certain expression of let's say quiet anger or aggressiveness under the surface, but he reveals very little. He keeps his emotions close to the vest. So for all intents and purposes, he's a closed book, and we don't know much about him in terms of emotional betrayal during the trial.
So it looked good for a good reaction. Is there some happy ending in this, if there can be such a thing? Tell us what the reaction is. What is Karen's reaction? What is everyone's reaction?
Yes, there's a positive ending insofar as when the jury comes back, Karen and her family get to hear the verdict read on all four counts as guilty, 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 and guilty. And the sentencing ends up being, 99 years plus 25, so a total of 124 years as a sentence for this man, with no chance for even a parole hearing until he'll be in his 80s. So yes, we can certainly call that the most positive result that she and her family could have hoped for. So their reaction, I think, is hard to describe. Maybe you'd call it ecstatic relief or something. Again, I'm hesitant to attach any kind of positive adjective to it because this girl has still been taken away from them forever, and nothing could ever change that. But for whatever counts as closure, I think they achieved that in that moment. The family collapses in tears and hugs endlessly And if nothing else, at least the man who did it has now been found, convicted, and will be put away.
Oh, that's incredible. Another, again, profound moment in the book is when Karen, as a testament to the work that she's done and the honor that is bestowed upon her, talks about at a CODIS convention, gives her story. Tell us a little bit about that. It's a big moment in the book as well.
Yeah, she had been invited to San Francisco, excuse me, at a CODIS convention to be the keynote speaker. And at that convention, she took the opportunity to tell Bonnie's story, to talk about the importance of trying to get the law and the policy changed in terms of collection of DNA on arrest. Sorry. And since then, she has now made it her personal crusade to try to get other states and in as many other jurisdictions as possible to implement this new law to collect DNA on arrest. And the reason for that, of course, is that if one thinks about it, had his DNA been in the system at the time of the murder, well, that could have been matched in a matter of literally weeks. So instead of the number of years that it took, not only for them to identify him, but for it to come to trial, it could have been 2 weeks, it could have been a month. Instead, her family had to go through that hell for 12 years before anyone was even identified, not to say nothing of the 4 years of pretrial and such. But the important point here is that if you have a database of DNA collected on arrest, then other families can be spared the kind of hell that Karen's family had to go through for that amount of time. Now, you can never erase the hell of losing a family member, much less a child, but you can minimize the time for having to live in that awful purgatory of not knowing.
And as many survivors and people mourning someone's death, there are groups where people in similar situations gather to support each other. But even more so in Karen's case, not only did she communicate and collaborate with people that were other victims, we get to hear in this story, in this book, other tragic stories too, that the people that are really lives are taken away from them. Most people would be devastated. These people have taken it upon themselves, very much like Karen, to join forces and join organizations and form organizations to be able to do what is absolutely necessary, thinking about people in the future, as you say, so that other people won't have to endure this. So they turn this it's negative is not even the word, this devastating life event, and do some good from this. So even though this book is a heartbreaking story of murder and years of almost this person getting away with this murder, it is somewhat of a happy ending in terms of the result for the betterment of the judicial system itself.
Yes, no, Dan, I think that's a very, very good way of putting it. I would return to almost my first statement in this interview, which was that, excuse me, when something like this happens, you have a choice, which is to go on or to not go on. And you have to define what going on means. And I think for most people, going on means trying to honor the legacy of the person whom you've lost in the best way you can. And in Karen's case, and the case of so many other parents and families, what that means is coming together to try to make changes to prevent other people from having to experience the same thing. And that's why I hold her in such great admiration, because she made the choice from moment one to do that, instead of to go into a shell, instead of to get angry, instead of to lash out, instead of to blame others. She immediately made the decision to try to get closure, but also to try to help others avoid having to go through this. And I don't think there's anything better you can say about a person.
Oh, that's great. I want to thank you very much, IJ, for coming on and talking about justice for Bonnie, an Alaskan teenager's murder, and her mother's tireless crusade for the truth. Karen Foster and IJ Schecter, Thank you very much. I wanted to know if there's a Facebook page for the book. Do you have a website? How people might contact you to get more information, or contact Karen or the organizations that she has set up? How might people follow this up with this interview?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me say thank you. It's been my great pleasure to speak to you, and I appreciate your giving us the forum to talk about this case. As I said, it's close to my heart, and I feel it's a very important one to talk about. There is a Facebook page for the book. One has to simply look up Justice for Bonnie. They can also look up either Karen or me on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, and we would be only too happy to talk to anybody about the case, about Bonnie, about how they might like to support the book or the story or the policy changes that we're trying to get done.
Well, it has been my pleasure, and I'm very happy to present this book. Not only is it just an incredible story, but again, a very, very honorable and important cause that's attached to this, and just makes for an even more fantastic book for people to enjoy. Thank you very much for this, and you have a great night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Be well.
Good night.